Welcome to our Purple Team Dialogues podcast.
With Steve Townsley and Richard Gold, a cybersecurity podcast focused on both offensive and defensive security. Do you want to introduce yourself, Steve, first of all?
Yeah, can do. So I'm Steve. I have been in, security for going on 20 years, but mostly military and doing more physical security stuff. And then in InfoSec for about 10 years. And my day job is I'm head of InfoSec for a Formula One team. And then on the side, I do LinkedIn and YouTube content and now a podcast. This is my first ever podcast. It's super exciting. I know, right? Yeah. I'm honored. Absolutely honored. And I've known you, Richard, for a while.
It's been a while, actually, believe it or not. It's been quite some time. I think it's getting on almost for 10 years. Can you believe that? And we used to work together.
We did for a couple of years.
I think you were actually my boss.
I don't believe that.
I do.
I still don't believe it. I love it. I'm very, very humbling. Well, lucky you.
Yeah, it was cool. You were actually.
It was a lot of fun.
It was a lot of fun.
It was a lot of fun. So we used to work together in threat intelligence for a vendor, and it was a great place. Well, it was for me just to dive into the threat landscape and learn what attackers do and how they do it.
Cool. So yeah, I'm Richard. I have been doing security for quite a while now. Too long for me to actually kind of recall, but definitely got interested in back in the 80s. Actually, there was a book which called Cyberpunk: Outlaws and Hackers on the Computer Frontier.
Now we're talking.
Which was actually really good, although I didn't realize it was a book written by some journalists about Kevin Mitnick and the East German guys who broke into the computers in the US university, got caught by Cliff Stoll, which is the story of the
Cuckoo's Egg. Yeah, nice.
Yeah. So all that kind of stuff. Cool. And my day job is I run a red team for a financial services company.
So we should have the offensive and defensive perspectives.
Absolutely, that's the goal, right?
Yeah, I love it.
So we're going to talk about this CrowdStrike Threat Report from 2024, and we're not really going to talk that much about, CrowdStrike versus Microsoft versus Mandiant versus whoever, but it's much more about how do you read a breach report? How do you get something out of it that's useful for you? And, you've got a background in intelligence, Steve, and you started off, with source evaluation, right?
Yeah, so source evaluation, if you work in intelligence professionally, is a big thing. And in, I think, InfoSec, it's a little bit murky where there's lots of different players and lots of different motives. So in the full-time, professional intelligence world, if you think about human intelligence, you're dealing with people and you're always thinking, well, who are they? How do they know what they know? Can we believe them? Do they want to influence us? And I think that applies to what we do in information security and some of the reporting that we see. So this particular piece, I think CrowdStrike are a really good source. I think they're very well placed. They've got a great threat intel team. They do threat hunting. They do security managed services. They do incident response. So they probably see a bunch of really interesting stuff. Equally, though, they're a vendor, right? And I would never say, I wouldn't say they're trying to lie or exaggerate in any means, but we should always just be cognizant that at the end of the day, they are trying to market.
Incentive, right? There's a commercial
100%.
incentive. Yeah. And it's interesting you mentioned how important source evaluation is in intelligence, and it's also the same in science. And I always thought of intelligence being science done in a rush, and I think that there's quite a nice interplay. So if you come from a sort of scientific background or an intelligence background, you'll see how important that is, and it's really good to have those kind of things in mind. That there may be, we always Hoya, right? Cognitive biases always at play. So it's good just to be mindful of those things.
Absolutely. And indeed, if you take the CrowdStrike reporting, I don't know how many customers they have globally. So if, say, you've got operations in the Far East, maybe China or inside Russia, for example, I don't know how much they would see of actors who would influence those spaces. So probably very good on Russia, China, nation state, but maybe less so on Five Eyes.
And is Russia, China, nation state actually, the most pressing issue that most organizations face, because it certainly gets a lot of the glamour, right, in cyber reporting. But if you think about, you're running a mid-sized supermarket, is the PLA the main threat actor you have to be concerned about?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think sometimes we do get a bit lost in attribution and talking about, the GRU or the FSB did this thing. And like, okay, well, I'm not cutting edge tech, or I'm not a foreign office, I'm not the Ministry of Defense. I kind of always worry about that, I guess, equally. And I think it's a point you've made previously, Richard, is the trickle down. So if nation states do it, probably a good chance at some point, depending on the actual access, obviously they've got very unique access at times. It's a good chance that the criminal groups, the really interesting ones that maybe more of us need to be worried about, might start doing the same thing.
Yeah, and I think definitely for the kind of technical pieces that can be easily turned into software. Now software has eaten the world. You can get a tool on GitHub, and that tool, you can use it, and it doesn't really matter as an attacker how sophisticated that is behind the scenes. That can be, Eternal Blue, right? When that got leaked, suddenly everybody was using it, from worms to ransomware crews or whoever. And it was obviously a very, very nice exploit behind the scenes. Was really, really cool, very, very stable, which is a very important quality for an exploit, as well as giving you like remote system on a Windows machine. But the thing is that those TTPs can be commoditized, I guess. But if you think about the really advanced things like setting up a front company to influence tech policy, that's not something I expect a criminal organization to be doing anytime soon.
No, and sadly, why bother a lot of the time? Because it seems that a lot of the stuff, I'm sure. Yeah, right. I'm sure we'll get into it, but it sounds like a lot of the basic stuff still works pretty well.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think one of the things that they say actually in the report, which I liked a lot, is they said, you don't have a malware problem, you have an adversary problem.
Nice, yeah.
That's actually, I think, a really good line. It doesn't mean that you need to worry about, the MSS or FSB getting into your network necessarily, but it's worth thinking about attackers as being motivated human individuals with a specific goal. And I think that's very different from safety as a discipline, which is a very, very mature discipline. They're about protecting human beings from machines, whereas we're about protecting computers from human beings. And I think that kind of mindset is really good. We were talking earlier about how to read these kind of reports, and I've got a couple of questions here which I like to have in my mind. Maybe Steve, you can give me your view on it. But the first one I'd like to ask always is before I'm looking at the report like this, do I understand what my critical assets are, and are they targeted by any of the adversaries mentioned in this report? Have I done that threat modeling?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really valuable place to start, isn't it? Because if you don't understand those, I think you can still do good security work, but it helps, right? If you know what's critical to you. And then obviously lean on, what's critical to the attackers. And I think sometimes they can be very separate things, right? Or maybe what's interesting to attackers.
Yeah.
So you care about something deeply and spend a lot of time protecting it, but ransomware doesn't care.
My favorite example of that was the, I think it was Thomson Reuters Twitter account that got taken over by an attacker and was then used to spread disinformation or about stock prices or potential mergers or whatever it was. But basically, it had a big impact on the stock market, and it was then became a big thing for the American government, and there's regulatory concerns with that kind of stuff. But you can imagine if you were running the Thomson Reuters InfoSec team, you probably wouldn't have thought back then, and this was a while ago, you wouldn't have thought that the Twitter account was a critical asset that you needed to protect in the way that you would protect your the databases with the most important data in.
Yeah, that's a great example, isn't it? And Yeah, to think that, is it 140 characters? Or it was back then, I think, wasn't it? A tweet could like move markets, and that somebody in your organization has that potentially protected with a single factor.
Yeah.
That's bonkers, isn't it? To think
and you'd have, I'm sure the password was shared for lots of people.
Oh, no doubt.
People need to use it.
Of course.
So it's probably something like Thomson Reuters, 17 or whatever it was.
And you can't SSO Twitter, I don't think, using certainly like enterprise SSO, so you can't control it. So then joiners, movers, leavers becomes tricky, and oh wow, that's pain.
Yeah. So then, the next question would be, who are your adversaries? So now you know what your critical assets are. Obviously there are commodity actors, and you mentioned ransomware being a great example of that. But are there any actors where your assets are of particular interest? Could be due to the sector that you work in or the geographical location. I think that's also quite an important thing to keep in mind. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, fundamentally, yes, in a big way, and that's where it can be quite tricky, right? And I know I was saying earlier, nation states, that's I'm not a foreign office or Ministry of Defence, but now you look at how maybe aggressive China are apparently being in the IP space, so stealing intellectual property and advanced tech. You start to think, crikey, are they now in the threat model of so many more organizations, because their kind of strategy is just, we need tech, so we'll just steal the IP. Happy days.
And it also, the one that always surprised me still was North Korea being behind the breach of Sony and then leaking all the data.
I remember that very well. Yeah.
And I'm going to fess up. I did not believe it was North Korea for a long time.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, because it was like loosely linked at the time, wasn't it, to the movie that was coming out that was very critical. I
thought they're not going to be doing that just because they got a movie. But
Guardians of Peace, wasn't it? That was their cover name. Yeah, it's coming back to me now. Yeah,
like the green skeleton,
Yeah, that's right. They had a terrible time. It's Sony Pictures Entertainment, wasn't it? Just got basically wiped out by North Korea. No, totally agree. And I think to some extent as well, like the Bangladesh Bank, I remember chatting to a former colleague of ours, and I was saying, there's no way that's North Korea. Like, what do they know about like Bitcoin and crypto? And he was like, it's kind of a thing for them. Like, they're making money off this. And that Lazarus group.
Yeah.
They had quite a run of it, didn't they?
Yeah, they went gangbusters on the crypto stuff. So I think that's something to keep in mind. And then what are the goals of these adversaries? I mean, obviously ransom and extortion, we're fairly familiar with them. Theft of easily monetizable assets. I mean, you mentioned Lazarus, going after crypto, credit card details being obviously another prime target for attackers. Intellectual property, you talked about China going after that. It's very popular, I think, for many threat actors to be going after that kind of stuff. They must have a value to all kinds of different regimes around the world for various reasons. And also, tying back to the Sony Pictures one, reputational damage. They just absolutely trashed every machine that they had in the estate, near enough, right? And that obviously causes a lot of reputational damage. It was front page news everywhere. And that could be a side effect of the attackers. And some organizations really live off their reputation. I mean, if you're a high street bank,
if you're in a very competitive sector where it's easy for people to move, or where security is a big part, like banking is a great example, right? Like, we rely on our banks to be secure. If somebody came along and said, "Did you know your bank's just been hacked and all your data's gone?"
Oh my god!
Right? Yeah, right.
You would have second thoughts, wouldn't you?
100%, yeah. And banking is another great example because it's so easy to move.
Yeah.
So easy. But then, of course, I guess if you're in an industry where you've got a massive monopoly, I think there's been some examples where like share price from a breach has been impacted for like a day. Or maybe it's actually, and then everyone's just carried on like everything's good. Nothing to see here.
That's another really interesting point, that it doesn't necessarily have the impact we think it does. We care about security, obviously as security professionals, we're in the thick of it every day. But, for many people out there, it's just not the priority it is for us, which is, understandable, because there's lots of other priorities that people have to juggle.
100%. Yeah. And I'm meant to be good at this stuff, and there's some issues I deal with. I won't name the vendors, right? Like, we struggle, like, technically to solve the problems. And like, this is the team doing it full time of people that are pretty good at it.
Yeah.
So yeah, how other organizations that don't have that expertise or that capacity, I really feel for them. But I loved your point a minute ago about knowing not just what data you have, but data that attackers are interested in, because it's like very common, like regurgitated best practice of you must start by knowing your critical assets. And I agree. I think it's a really smart place to start. So you might spend ages, securing your database, but the ransomware crew just get into your file transfer application, lift terabytes of data, and then extort you. Like same effect.
Yeah.
And it was never on your radar because it's not important data, right? It's not a critical asset.
Yeah, and I think that was definitely one of the massive fallouts of such widespread ransomware attacks, that suddenly people started to see their IT estate as a critical asset, because it's a resource, it's a very powerful resource. The other one was, of course, mining, crypto miners. And there's been all kinds of, horror stories of attackers getting into cloud environments, generating huge AWS bills by spinning up, massive machines and just mining the hell out of them. So yeah, that's another example of what you might think is important. It's not necessarily what the attacker cares about. And you may have had all kinds of important data there, but they didn't care. They just wanted to mine some crypto.
And I think in some cases, compromise the right inbox, and you've got enough. You've got enough to extort a company. And I've chatted to a few people about this. Take inboxes as an example. Like, they're just repositories now for data. Like, we leave so much in there, and you get the right person. Or if you get let's say you just pop an Office 365 account, you've got Inbox, OneDrive, SharePoint, Teams. Oh my goodness, you've got a lot of, and that's with no privilege, right? That's just a user account.
Exactly. You don't need to do all of that crazy, funky, hacky stuff. If you can just log in and it's all there. I think it's also why so in the commercial field, the commercial area, vendors like NSO Group, they're all about targeting phones. And I think that's really significant, that these companies who are selling a service to governments, that their top target is iPhone and Android, because you get onto somebody's phone.
Gosh, yeah, wow.
And you've got everything. I mean, because normally all of those services you just mentioned, if it's a corporate device, will probably be on there in some capacity through the mobile variant. And then you have all of their iMessage, Signal, whatever it is that people are using for comms. And they can sometimes be even more significant because they're not, they're off network, right? Off corporate network comms.
Yeah. So there's no firewall, there's no filter, there's no proxy. Like, it's invisible, isn't it, to the security team? And that's interesting, isn't it, with the push to all these apps using end-to-end encryption. That's great, but then if somebody pops the device, then they're gonna hoover up a lot of data. I guess the good news with mobile, certainly iOS, is what's the going rate for like a no-click iOS exploit, like 1 million or something? It might be
definitely.
more now.
It's even more now, I think.
So they're pretty solid. Android I can't speak to, but I think the kind of groups using those or targeting phones is pretty sophisticated, generally speaking. Where they're definitely compromising phones, but maybe we'll get on to a bit how other people are doing clever stuff to access people's data on mobile phones, or certainly MFA codes, right?
And I think it lends itself quite well to the next question, which is, we've talked about these threat actor groups, talked about what they're after. Now, what are the typical TTPs that they are using is to achieve their goals? I think is the kind of final big question that I often have, because that helps you understand what you need to do. So now you know what the groups are likely to try. You can then figure out, okay, well, how are they going to do it? And then you can think about your own environment and how well that maps. I mean, a lot of this stuff, and looking through the report, it's stuff that we've seen time and time again, right? And this is kind of one of the sort of InfoSec Pandora kind of problems. And we've been saying the same things, right, for a lot of time. As attackers, we use a lot of the same TTPs with minor modifications, of course, but at a high level, phishing, it's kind of a thing. It kind of works. It's been around, right? This shouldn't be news to anybody. But there's we'll probably talk about that in a minute. But some other kind of maybe more surprising things like compromising edge devices and of course cloud. But I think it's really helpful to try and figure out what's the most important TTPs to protect against. So then that you're aligned. what the threat actors are likely to use, what assets they're likely to target, and you can start to figure out what you can do about it.
And I think if you work in maybe a smaller organization or even a bigger complex one, and you can't answer those early questions of, well, what are my critical assets? What are attackers interested in? If you can only do one thing, like personally, I think focusing on the current TTPs will take you a long, long way.
Yeah.
And I totally agree. Like phishing is a thing, and it's going to continue being a thing, right? And yeah, it's going to evolve a little bit, and we've seen lots of that. But it's going to be a thing, and then endpoints, they're going to try and be compromised. Like it's a thing. Privileged accounts will be targeted, and none of these things are going away. And I've not read it for a few years, but going back to the cuckoo's egg, I'm pretty sure there's abuse of identity and compromised accounts in that.
Yes.
When was that? Like 70s, 80s?
That was the mid 80s, if memory serves.
Wow.
It's actually all of the kind of stuff that we see these days. You will see the same thing. They were password brute forcing. They were taking advantage of easily guessable passwords. There was the exploitation. There was actually like an actual exploit that was being used, the MoveMail one. But it was something where there had been a patch released, but the patch hadn't been applied. All of those kind of things that we've seen, time and time again. So yeah, I don't expect a lot of these things to change. So it's good to get on top of what you think your attackers are likely to use.
Yeah, and kind of avoid all that fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Talking about like all the latest quantum cryptography, which is fascinating, by the way, or like AI, ML attacks, and I'm waving my arms a lot around because I just don't think they're a thing, but they're not the biggest, most critical thing that attackers are going to keep doing. And I have a series on LinkedIn called On This Day in InfoSec, where I just post on the anniversary of like big breaches or like reports. And I always try and include the TTPs if they're known. And often, like going back to Sony, I think if you look at the technical details there, it's nothing mad. Like it's initial access with, I can't remember, but it was probably phishing. Hop to shell, probably found a domain admin cred, and then moved around from there. Like it's such a common pattern. And I remember last year I was involved helping someone out with a ransomware attack, a friend of mine. And before they told me what had happened, I pretty much guessed the entire attack path. And that's not, I'm not bigging myself up, just it's such a common pattern.
And I think that's what's so effective or frightening about the ransomware crews is that they have figured this out. They have industrialized this process and they have rolled it out, at a mass scale. They've got all this affiliate programs and ransomware as a service and all this kind of stuff to industrialize and commoditize that process of exactly that attack path. Fish your way in, look for credentials. Probably you're privileged anyway, because a lot of places, many users have admin credentials. Use those to laterally move, escalate privileges as you go till you get to the point where you can deploy something using SCCM or GPO, and then you can shove your ransomware onto every machine in the AD, and that's it, right?
Happy days. Yeah, makes a bank. Start negotiations.
Yeah. So
it's wild.
It is. So should we dig into the paper a little bit?
Let's do it. Yeah, let's do it. I've got some notes. I've read it thoroughly.
What kind of jumped out at you on this one?
So I think that top four they talk about, so the identity attacks on the increase, cloud attacks on the increase, third-party relationship exploitation, and then they sort of talked about vulnerabilities on the edge. And that first one, identity, I know we've already touched on it, but there's some really interesting detail there. And this is where, like we've talked about, these reports are or can be so valuable, is I think this highlights maybe the danger a little bit of sleepwalking into MFA is great. MFA is great, by the way. Like
MFA
we should all use MFA, but it's not that silver bullet because attackers are evolving. They're not just going to give up because all of us have got like SMS MFA, and there's some examples in there where attackers were successfully phishing people, either with email phishing, a bit of SMS phishing, voice phishing, and able to either socially engineer the MFA being moved to them or socially engineer the MFA code. Like it's quite scary because I think a lot of us on the blue team side put a lot of comfort maybe in MFA, and particularly the some of the groups they talk about, like the barrier to entry sounded quite low.
Oh, definitely.
Call at the help desk.
Yeah.
Hi,
I'm John.
Yeah, I've lost my phone.
Yeah.
Can I get a password reset and MFA?
And I think you mentioned something really important when we were talking about it earlier, that sometimes people don't realize, organizations don't realize how privileged the people on the help desk are, because you need them to reset passwords and stuff like that. And I remember in one, not this paper, but another paper from a few months ago, it was they were using these tactics to do a password reset for really privileged accounts. So ones that had, application administrator in Azure or something like this, or something equivalent, right? And that's really spooky, because suddenly your help desk is on the front line against the KGB, right? That's
right.
I'm stealing a phrase from the Grok here, but I think that's a really good phrase. Is that if you sign up to do IT help desk, foiling hostile foreign intelligence services was probably not mentioned.
Yeah, right. Not a competency we were interviewing for. Yeah, and of course those folks, they're all about availability and helping people out, and making sure they're burning through tickets efficiently so they can keep the business moving. And to your point, why should they need to say, is this person the Russian state? Am I being socially engineered? Right? Like, I get it. Yeah, it's tough. And I think from the blue team side, this is one I pulled out of the report. It's not letting people be in that position. So exactly, privileged accounts or privileged roles, if you think Entra, are very well protected and can only be controlled by certain people, or if certain conditions are met in identity, or indeed using things like conditional access. And I don't know what the equivalent is for other identity providers, where actually you can have someone external to your organization have even like global admin, but they won't be able to use it. And that can be really powerful.
I think that's a really good point. And it's something which has been clear to me over time of working in security. Excess privilege is one of the worst enemies you have when you're trying to do effective security. And I think that you're managing privileged access is very, very difficult. It's extremely difficult.
And that's before you get into like tech, right? And buying a PAM tool or like some sort of secrets vault. And I've been there on the blue team side of saying to a bunch of people, right, we need to pull you out of the domain admins group, and like anarchy, right? Like at the end of the way, no, you can't do that. That's not, everything's going to break, and taking people on that journey. And you think, guys, like there's so many breach reports where this is obviously not the way to do it. Like least privilege is a thing, but it's honest work.
It is very challenging. I think there's a really cool thing, which is the hierarchy of hazard controls for how do you handle toxic materials, and they have ranked efficacy of controls, and this is like a very standard thing that you're supposed to follow if you're working in this space. And the top most strong control is security by elimination, or safety by elimination, which is remove it. You can't attack what's not there. So if the user isn't in the domain admins group, they're not there. They don't have that privilege. And I think getting a handle on that is so challenging, because it means you have to really understand your organization, your business, how everything works. But that, I think, is really absolutely critical.
And that's where, with some other reports of this kind of nature that I read, where, and I think as InfoSec folks, and I was guilty of this when I first moved to InfoSec, when I was in threat intel, of going like, why aren't people fixing this? Like technically, like this is such an easy thing to do, right? And then when you get like into the trenches, into the weeds of this, you're like, okay, now I get it. Like this is not a click my fingers overnight solve problem.
There's this phrase, right? Just, and that's in bunny rabbit ears, just is the worst word in the English language. Why don't you just patch? Why don't you just roll out MFA?
Hang on, let me write this down. That's a great idea. I should just patch. How are you spelling MFA?
Right. And it's so easy for us, or for people who are not involved with a particular organization, to stand on the sidelines and criticize. But the reality is, because these things are so complex and complicated and require such an orchestration of people, processes, and technology, it's very hard.
100%. Yeah. And on the privilege side, one thing I do all the roles I've started. And if anyone's listening to this, I highly recommend, if you've got Windows environment, just go enumerate the domain admins group, and then just take that list and just like, this is a free thing. I say free, I'm doing it in inverted quotes. Anybody could do. You cut that down, and like to what we're talking about, you just remove that attack surface. Yeah. You can't hack a domain admin if they've not got domain admin.
Yeah, and it just goes. And also, I would say that enumerate your domain admins, because attackers are enumerating your domain admins.
Yeah, right. yeah. And again, in breach reports, it doesn't come up in the CrowdStrike report. Like it's really interesting. You just see the same command get running again and again, right? Like, what is it? Net groups, domain admins, /domain. Hey, there's all the domain admins. I'm going to go and break into them. But again, there's so many layers of complexity, aren't they? Because I think once you solve domain admins on the on-prem AD world, there's like all these other roles and groups that actually have other like really
the thing is that you see this as an evolution of tradecraft by attackers, is solving that domain admin issue. And I know it's difficult, but depressingly is actually easy compared to what comes next, which is managing that excessive privilege, because there's DNS admins, which is also have a reliable path to DA and effective domain admin privileges. And it can even be the case that as an attacker, to achieve your goal, you're not even interested in domain admin. If it turns out that there's a particular backup service that contains the data that you want, you're going to go after that. And if you have a notion of good tradecraft, you're not going to go noisy by trying to pop a user in the domain admin group when you don't need to do it. So it's definitely, it's something you need to do, necessary but not sufficient. But it's not complete, because there's an on-prem AD, and now, of course, with cloud hybrid joined, have privilege just can exist in so many different places.
The report talks about this, the jumping between on-prem and cloud, and then cloud to on-prem, and in some worst case scenarios, I'm sure there's users who their on-prem account is synced to cloud account has global admin, on-prem account has domain admin. If you compromise that account, oh my days, like you game over.
Yeah.
But to your point, which I think is so true, is attackers have been evolving, and I think this happened before this year and when this report was published, but ransomware groups increasingly are going to take data as well. So if they can't deploy their ransomware, they've already exfiltrated all your file shares or your SharePoint or your HR system, whatever it may be. That's enough to extort you.
Yeah. And you can see in the report, they have a very interesting thing, which is the search terms typically used by ransomware groups.
Yes, I love that. Yeah.
There's some pretty spicy topics in there, and you can really see how targeting that kind of information would be of real concern to a business. So I think that these groups, I've made a note here, especially about that scattered spider, they really understand companies. They understand how companies work. They know how IT help desk works. They know how password reset policies, workflows typically go. They understand how MFA is typically deployed, and they have such a nuanced and deep understanding of how companies operate and what upsets them. To your point about extortion, that's actually I find them almost more frightening than the nation states.
Yeah. No, me too. Because I think, as we were saying earlier, those nation states, the people thereafter is maybe a bit more limited, but the ransomware crews, it's all of us. Do we need to like an outro? Like, hey, this was fun. If they get in, they're going to have a go. And you bring in access brokers and the whole, like, it just blows open that kind of landscape of people getting into your organization, not because you're doing something cool or trendy or you're heavily targeted, just because they can.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
They can lock you down, extort you, or steal your data, drop that online, and extort you for that as well. And it's it's been I think an evolution over the last few years, which is getting a bit scary.